Name and please tell us what you do for a living.
I am James Andrew Wynn Jr. I'm a judge on the Fourth Circuit United States Court of Appeals. And I have served here since President Obama put me here in 2010. Before that, I served for 20 years on the state Supreme Court for North Carolina and the State Court of Appeals.
Please provide us a brief overview of landmark civil rights legislation, including a timeline.
Thank you. I'm happy to do so. It is a very important question. It encompasses quite a bit. I mean, and in order to be able to really address that question, you really need to go back to the end of the Civil War, in which you had the newly freed slaves and the freed Black Americans at that time. And Congress saw fit to enact what has come to be known as the Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. And it was the 13th Amendment that essentially ended slavery in America. That was done on December 6th, 1865. But the 13th Amendment in and of itself really didn't convey any rights. And quite frankly, I think there were many in America who saw that they were all for freedom of the slaves, but they weren't in favor of citizenship and other rights. But Congress saw a need to expand this because what was happening in the South at the time was a continued abuse and mistreatment of African Americans at that time. So it enacted the 14th Amendment. And it was the 14th Amendment that actually conferred citizenship onto the new slaves, that anyone who is born in the United States of America, no matter where you come from, if you're born here, and that's the so-called birthright, then you become a citizen. But it did something else. It also created what is called due process and equal protection under the laws. You might not know this, but I'll tell you, in every piece of civil rights litigation, every discrimination suit, all of the cases that involve voting rights arise under the 14th Amendment. It is the most litigated part of the Constitution. But the 14th Amendment did something else. It did a lot, but it did not go quite as far in terms of voting. There still was that issue of, was there a right to vote? And that's what the 15th Amendment did. The 15th Amendment conveyed the right to vote on African Americans and those of African descent in this country. And so with those three amendments called the Reconstruction Amendment, then we launch into what you've asked about, and that is the civil rights legislation. That actually began in 1866, a year after the 13th Amendment was passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was a well-intended act. It was intended to give a citizenship right, equal protection. This is before the 14th recall. But the problem with it was, well, first thing happened is Andrew Johnson, who you might know was widely regarded as perhaps the worst president in the United States until recent time. There's some other statements about that, but I won't get into that. Andrew Johnson actually vetoed it, but Congress overrode that veto and it became law. But it wasn't enough, because the Civil Rights Act of 1866, for all the good that it intended, it did not include any remedies or penalties for it. So it became a method by which the Ku Klux Klan and other groups could abuse it. So Congress decided, and that's how the 14th Amendment came about as a result of that, to confer citizenship on individuals and to convey certain other rights. Once you get past the 1866, you go almost a full century until 1857. And in 1857, Congress passed another act called the Civil Rights Act of 1857. And in effect, what this act did is it established a commission on civil rights, and it tasked it with collecting data. The importance of that, it sounds like that's not much, but the importance of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 in terms of saying, well, elected officials, you got to collect data on discrimination. You got to collect data on civil rights investigation and investigations, and you got to keep it for a certain period of time. Well, what that did was it opened up an opportunity for other civil rights legislation to be created. because by collecting this data, it became a basis, a constitutional basis, if you will, for states, for Congress to then begin enact other acts. So it did so. In 1960, you had a Civil Rights Act of 1960. That one was there to help with the right to vote. What was happening is you had poll tax, you had all kinds of application ways of registration requirements that kept people from voting. And so this act created the Commission on Civil Rights, and it sought to again, to preserve these records on voter registration practices and things. But it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that's perhaps the most important one of all. In 1964, in the aftermath of John Kennedy being assassinated, President Johnson is in office, Martin King has marched all over. This is a time where you've had the all kinds of violations. You've had the Edmund Pettus type situation that's developing with voting rights. John Lewis and others are marching. You've had the Brown versus Board of Education, but so much needed to be done. And what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did, it created a law that said it outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And as a result of that, it also created what was called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So with that, that powerful piece of legislation, there was one other thing that needed to happen. And that happened in 1965. And that was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Many of you have heard about it, and I'm sure it's something that you're familiar with, but essentially the Voting Rights of 1965 created laws that made it unlawful for you to discriminate in the registration process. It also created an important part, you've heard many times, called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Well, Section 5 essentially said that there were certain areas in the country, go back to what I said earlier, all that data that had been collected under the Voting Rights Act of 1957 and 1960, all that data pointed to there was invidious discrimination and disparate treatment in certain parts of the country, far worse than others. So the Voting Rights of 1965 made it impose a burden on certain communities. I mean, South Carolina and North Carolina had enormous areas in which they were covered under this act. If you were covered under this act, you couldn't change your laws with regard to voting and election without getting what was called pre-clearance from the Justice Department. It became a tremendous and powerful tool to ensure that discrimination and other wrongs were not being done. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court in 2013, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, what it did is says, well, you can't do this anymore because your data that supports this, be it from the Voting Rights Act of 1957 and 1960 and since, is too old. It doesn't comport with this. The conditions may have changed. And so Congress go back and change it. Well, Congress hasn't done that yet. I think there's some strong hope that Congress will do that and create a new Voting Rights Act, Section 5. But to do that, I will tell you what it's going to require. It's going to require cooperation. It's going to require people to be honest in providing data to support this legislation, so it can, even if it's passed by Congress and signed by the president, it still has to withstand Supreme Court scrutiny of being constitutional. So that's, I know that's a quick overview. Probably there are law school courses that go the whole semester on what I just went through with you. And there are people who could spend hours and hours, and I could. But I wanted to give you that brief overview. And notice I started with the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Went from that, went into the various Civil Rights Act from 1866, and then skipped almost to 100 years up to 1957, jumped past to John Kennedy being assassinated, very important happening because it really propelled this nation in a whole different mindset. It was a time in which things were very, very tense in this country. Of course, you had the Vietnam War and other things, but that led to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and ultimately to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the final piece of legislation popped up in 1968. That was the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and that was the Fair Housing Act. So that's where we are today, and that's an overview.
What is the importance of having laws to protect civil rights? Why are they important to democracy?
Well, laws on the books that protect civil rights, what they ensure is they ensure that people aren't excluded from the American dream, the promises of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so, even though you had the freedom that was granted under the 13th Amendment, even though you had citizenship and equal protection under laws guaranteed under the 14th Amendment, and then you had the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, beyond that, what the newly free slaves and those after them found was there were still being enacted black codes and Jim Crows and redlining and lynchings were occurring, all in violation of rights, but you had no constitutional no legislative acts to enforce it. So that's the significance of those laws that were done is to help aggrieved citizens find a remedy in America for some of the ills that occur here. And it's important. It's important in a democracy that we have freedom, and you can't make a people free from slavery and then at the same time have everyone else enjoying the spoils and the goods of a country and denying them these same rights for no other reasons other than the color of their skin or that they come from different backgrounds. So what these legislative things do is, I think what they've done is they've opened up and given greater opportunities. Now, to be sure, every time these laws have been limited. So you see that even though you enact a law, it doesn't end the situation, because I don't care how strong you make a legislation, how much you work with it and try to make it right, there's always someone going to find a loophole or a way to get around it. And then in an effort to discriminate, be it for an economic purpose or be it because of some other nefarious purposes. So it is an ongoing process, the enactment of civil rights legislation and legislation of that type.
Okay. Judge, you talked a little bit in the timeline about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. How did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 pave the way for subsequent legislation that protects the right of additional, marginalized, and disenfranchised groups?
Well, when you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, just that in of itself, which opened up opportunities to challenge things like gerrymandering, which was the voting restricting rights. It also led to the Age Discrimination Act of 1967, so that you just can't get rid of someone just because they got older in life. That alone cannot be the factor. It led to the Americans with the Disabilities Act, which is a good act. I mean, you think about it, should you be able to discriminate against someone because they have a disability, even though they can do the work and they have all the capability of doing so? And it also, which in and of itself made it necessary to have provisions for people with disabilities. And then you got the hate acts that come up, the Matthew Shepard Act that came out recently in the James Byrd Act to deal with hate crimes, where one would seek more toward gender discrimination, seek to treat people different simply because they have a different orientation of their sexuality or whatever, has nothing to do with their abilities. And it doesn't give you a constitutional right to discriminate against people because they have a different preference in life. And that's the American way. So I think when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which I would call the landmark act, that was the major one. All the rest of them were great. I'm not saying they're not great, but that was really a blockbuster, and it continues to be so with the reach that it has today.
Last question, Judge. Do you think Dr. King would be proud of where we are in regards to civil rights in this country?
Well, let's see, Dr. King, that's a good question. I love the question, because I have to think about it in a more holistic way. I mean, what we talk about in relation to segregation, discrimination, economic justice, it's a complex thing. But I will say this, I believe Dr. King would acknowledge that this country has come a long ways. We've got people of all shades, colors, genders, and sexualities who are now involved in the highest level of government. They're in the private sector, they're in academia. We have our children are basically seeing that they may have opportunities to go virtually anywhere in the world, particularly now that we've had a president of the United States who was a president of color. But Dr. King, in doing that, and I say, I think that's the honest part about it, is to look at it and say, The old song says, we're not where we want to be, but thank God we ain't where we was. Well, when we view it that way, I say Dr. King would also, because you will recall that even when Dr. King was assassinated, it wasn't about discrimination on the streets. It was about economic discrimination on unions. And he began to venture into the Vietnam War. He always fought for justice, and that what it was, bend toward the moral arc of justice. He always fought for that. So he would look, and he would be protesting the mass incarceration of African American men across this country. He would be dealing with the state-sanctioned violence, to deal with police brutality. And I know he would be involved with these economic questions and those disparities that exist in this day and age with healthcare. He wouldn't be blind to that. He wouldn't be celebrating and having a good time about the good stuff. He would be out there at the forefront. I just know it. There's segregation going on in cities right now, the environmental concerns, there's discrimination. There's a lot. He would be involved. He would be a busy man. I have no doubt in my mind. So if anyone get the idea that Dr. King would be back just happy, with the accomplishment, I do not believe that for one moment. Because there's so much that's going on in our country in terms of ongoing situations. Now, so how do I view him in terms of what's going on now? If I saw with discrimination, I would say, well, he would look at how they treated those Black Lives Matters protesters and what recently happened. He certainly would have been at the forefront of that and say, okay, that's discrimination. And how are you going to argue against that? He would look at the restricted laws that have come out on voting, gerrymandering, the political gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has sanctioned, and how it impacts Black voters and all these efforts to try to suppress Black votes and keep people from voting. He might have a lot of joy, though, in the fact that Black people came out and voted in numbers never before. Now, he would get a little joy out of that. But he would also look at this coronavirus, and he would be looking right now, in my mind, you asked this question, so I'm going there with you, I'm telling you, because he would not, there's nowhere in the world he would sustain what's going on with the coronavirus and stomach the fact that so many African Americans are dying and being sick and lacking health care measures, and yet the country is moving on, and there are those out there that don't wear masks and don't do this, and that is yet happening, to people of color. So yeah, he'd be happy, but he would still say our work is not yet done. Because you can abolish slavery, you can pass this legislation, you can do all this, but that moral universe is still bends toward the arc of justice. So you ask that question. My question that would flow from this would take that question from Dr. King and said, well, it would take a little further and says, how would he look at the legislation? I would also ask that anyone who's looking or considering, what you ought to be asking is, what would Dr. King say, or would he be proud of what we are doing as individuals and what we're doing collectively? Is what you're doing, is that something Dr. King would be proud of? And that's part of what the old folks would call, I guess I'm one of the old people now, called the good fight. Are you still fighting the good fight? Are you devoting your time? Are you devoting your pocketbook? Are you out involved in civil rights movement? Are you standing up for justice? Are you out there speaking out against discrimination and those who are oppressed and those who are less fortunate? That's the Dr. King that I think we would have today. And I get excited just thinking about when you say today, Lord, we just need a Dr. King so much, a Dr. King, but the memory and what he stood for lives on. And that's the beauty of it. I think we can feel him in a lot of things we do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just say also, I want to thank my friends Carlton and Michelle Dallas, because they've been dear friends. Carlton himself, almost a lifelong friend, and they are so involved. They are the ones who prevailed on me to participate, and I am so happy to do so. I look forward to the time when the virus lifts and I can come down and visit Hilton Head.